Hey, Travis here with another video in my increasingly disheveled series of videos on audiobook narration techniques. Today I wanted to talk about pace. For a variety of reasons, it's been top of mind lately, none of which I'm going to go into, but it is really interesting to talk about, and I've been meaning to do this for a while because questions about pacing come up an awful lot online for audiobook narrators, folks new to it, and even people who have been doing it for a while and want to tweak it further. So I thought I would dig into that a little bit today. I think that there's a lot of simple answers that we all quickly give to new narrators to deal with pacing and to answer questions about pace, usually along the lines of slow down, which I think is often good advice, but is also maybe not tackling all of the elements of slowing down that exist. And I think pacing is a little bit more complicated than that. So I want to talk about those more complicated aspects of it. I want to kind of break them down into a way that's hopefully understandable for you and that allows you to better target where you are going to tune your pace in order to get the effect that you actually want. So, let's give a quick overview. I want to talk about what I consider the three main components of pace, which are your speaking rate, the way that you manage pausing in between phrases, and technique, all of which have a big bearing on the comprehensibility of the audio that you deliver and can be lumped together into the idea of pace. But often, new narrators are really only thinking about the first one, how fast they're talking. So I really want to break that down. The other thing I want to talk about is the frames of reference for managing your pace, because pace is something that happens over time. And there's a local frame of reference, the immediate feel of the pacing right now, and then there's a cumulative sense over a longer period of time, a larger frame of reference, for how our pacing has felt to the listener over a long listening experience. Many paragraphs, many pages, the whole chapter. Because this stuff, it all builds as you go along, and it's worth being cognizant of how to manage it within those two frames of reference. And then as part of that, I want to talk about a little trick or two that you can use to ideally build a more physical connection for yourself to pace so that it's easier for you to isolate what is going on so you can decide what you want to do. Now, um, before we get into any of that, one of the things I do want to say up front is that I consider pacing to be performance. If you're a new narrator, I would love to impart to you the idea that you should be responsible for your pace, that you don't expect someone to come in after the fact and adjust it or fix it for you. That once you have committed the audio and you have sent it off to proofing or editing or a publisher or whatever, that in your mind, the pacing of that audio is correct and nobody should have to do anything. In fact, I really dislike it if anybody does anything to audio that I have already recorded because I did that stuff intentionally. And the person coming in after the fact they're not going to have thought about it anywhere near as much as I did or devoted anywhere near as much energy to the pacing of that audio production. So I'm a big one for having the narrator be wholly responsible for that. Um, Another thing I want to say is that if you are trying to take the temperature and work on your pace, one thing that I have found very useful to do, and this is what I do, is I'll listen to the sample of the previous book I did. And the reason that I listen to the sample instead of, as I'm going along is because it gives me some distance from it. If you've heard kind of the story about Stephen King, when he finishes writing a book, he puts it in a drawer and he comes back a month later. And when he comes back and reviews the book, he has a new level of objectivity about it. He's not so close to it. So things that would not have jumped out at him the first time now do. And I want that because I want that distance from when I first recorded that. That sample's usually a good candidate. It's usually from the beginning of the book. So that when I listen back, I can say, oh, I'm feeling a little breathless, or this feels a little sloggy. I find it valuable. So the nice thing about a sample also is it's limited in time. You want something more than 30 seconds. And 5 minutes is not a bad kind of checkup. So as a rule, I listen back to my samples. I'm basically always tinkering my pace. I never consider it a done job. And every book, of course, is different. But just my technique for managing the rate at which I speak and how I allow the user to come along with me is something that just never feels like it's over for me. So don't feel bad if you're messing with your pace. I, I'm doing it all the time. Um, all right. With those preambles out of the way, let's talk about the three main components that I listed of pace. The first being the rate at which you speak. I can't give you a lot of super magical knowledge here. It's how fast the words are coming out of your mouth. It is a component of pace. Um, and I think as new narrators, that's often all we think about. How fast am I saying the words? Which is important. You want the rate at which you speak the words to A, be appropriate to the text. The text dictates the pace. The book is going to give you all kinds of clues about what you want to do. But, B, you just got to be able to tell what's being said. So, um, and to go back to that, the text dictating it for you, that doesn't mean that there's only one pace that a piece can be read in. Every narrator is going to interpret differently, but you should be making a performance decision. It shouldn't be arbitrary, and it shouldn't be a global decision. I read everything at the same pace. It should be guided by what the text says and what it says to you and how you feel that ought to be evoked to best get across what the author wants to do. So bear that in mind. Not a lot I can give you there. Let's talk about part 2, though, which is the spacing in between, which I think is one of the most important parts of pace. Now, we often say to slow down, but I want to make an observation, which is that my admittedly anecdotal evidence is that mostly people speed books up. There's a lot of people listening at 1.5 and 1.7 and, God forbid, 2.0, but very seldom do I hear about people slowing it down. It does happen, clearly. And I'm basing this mostly on asking people about it and on combing reviews, but that evidence suggests that mostly people speed things up. That predominantly when people are adjusting speed off of 1.0, they're going faster, not slower. So I don't feel comfortable just slowing things down universally all over the place. That doesn't feel right to me. But I think a lot of the people where they're feeling that a text is delivered too fast, it's not moment to moment they simply can't tell what you're saying. It's that they just never get a chance to catch their breath. It's like dragging somebody along when you run faster than them. They just can't ever quite get their feet under them because they don't get an opportunity to do so. So I feel, in general, that pacing in between what's being said is some of the most key things to look at when you're adjusting the technique for your pacing. I mentioned, kind of a little trick to do with this. I think that it's hard as a narrator to have kind of a physical connection to not saying anything because it's an absence of doing something, right? So one thing that I think that you might try as a little trick to see if you can help build that connection, it's almost like when you lift weights and you haven't really explicitly used a muscle before, you have to build what's called a mind-muscle connection so that mentally you understand what has to happen for this muscle to flex and do what it needs to do. So to maybe build that mind-muscle connection, here's a little technique that you can try. I like to hold up my hand, and my open hand is for nothing happening, for dead air. My closed hand is for when I'm speaking. And the idea is that as I'm delivering a series of sentences, that I'm physically opening my hand when I get to dead air and then closing it again when I speak to have this sort of physical analog for what's going on. So I'll show you what I mean. Swords shoved up from the ground, almost as tall as Lyndon was, but he tore them apart with his right hand. While they tangled him up, a shadow blade flashed at him at neck height. Orthos plowed into Harmony from behind. The Akura turned, catching his shell with one gauntlet, but Orthos spun and whipped his tail into the shadow artist's chest. Harmony flew back, gauntlets dissipating to essence and violet crystal boots appearing on his feet. They bit into the stone, stopping him instantly as he fired another striker blade at Orthos. So he wasn't watching when Lyndon broke through the techniques and landed in front of him, burning cloak blazing around him. He punched Harmony with his right hand, but White Fist met purple as Harmony got his gauntlet up. And just having that physical connection makes there's an intentionality to those pauses that starts to build up this almost a record of what has happened. Because I talked a little bit about frame of reference. Let's bring that in right here. As I'm reading along, I've got a pretty good local frame of reference. I have a good handle on how I have paced things recently as part of what I just said. But especially as narrators, because we stop, we make mistakes, we have to punch in, it's very easy to lose sort of this historical record of how did I manage the breathing room in these passages while, over this longer period of time, which is important, but is really hard to keep hold of. And that's something I constantly struggle with. And I think doing a little bit of practice and just training that sort of physical connection, that intentionality of action helps to bake that a little bit more into your head about what you have already done so that you can be cognizant of how you've allowed this to build. Because pacing is cumulative. It's not just the moment to moment read. If this is a long chapter and a lot of breathless action happens, have I given the listener enough time to catch their breath and comprehend what happened and to, transition to this next scene? It's sometimes hard to remember if you've done that, but it's really important to the overall pacing of a chapter because they can just get further and further and further behind if it doesn't have those pauses, that they just never catch up. And all of a sudden now they do have to slow it down, or they, close it in disgust and delete it from their library or give it a refund. So again, that physical connection, those frames of reference. Now, the third thing we talked about is technique. And I'll give you a quick example. If you had two different narrators that read the exact same passage at exactly the same rate, I can almost guarantee that one of them would be more comprehensible to you than the other, and it would be due to technique. That's how they accentuate individual syllables, the musicality of their speech, how well the technique that they apply with pitch and emphasis and all of the other tools at their disposal to support the meaning of the sentence in the way that they have delivered it, regardless of how fast. There's all of these things that you do with your pitch and your enunciation that support the meaning of the speech underneath. So one of them is probably going to have better technique, and it means that you're going to understand things better. Now, Travis, you say that doesn't have anything to do with pace. Well, it does, because that's what allows the rate at which you speak to be comprehensible. So you can't really divorce them from each other. Someone who speaks more comprehensibly through technique can deliver text faster, and the listener won't notice the difference. They might be more understandable than a slower narrator with poorer technique. And the ultimate goal is comprehensibility and the satisfaction of the listener in hearing this, that this is being delivered to them in a way that they appreciate. So whatever tools make that happen is what's important. This happens a lot when people are talking about their issues with anything. I think it was Neil Gaiman that said, if the reader tells you something's wrong, they're almost always right. But if they tell you why it's wrong, they're almost always wrong, or something to that effect. And I think that you need to bear that in mind when you're thinking about pace, because there are so many little things that you can fiddle with that the blanket assumption that you just need to slow down may not accurately diagnose the problem that you need to address. So that's kind of my general thoughts on pace. Let's add a little something else on here, because this is something that comes up kind of like as a little sidecar. People talk about pacing in action scenes, and there's often an assumption that you need to speed up, and that's not always the case. What's maybe a good example for that is Zack Snyder, right? So if you've ever watched Watchmen or Justice League or whatever, a Zack Snyder movie, The 300, you'll notice that a lot of his action scenes are remarkably slow. In fact, slow-mo is used all over the place. But then it's followed up with very kinetic, fast moments. So when you're narrating pacey scenes, action scenes, moments of tension, it's not always about speeding up. Sometimes it is, but it's often a balance of the two. And again, you're going to let the text ideally tell you what needs to happen. It's not going to be all one or the other. It's probably going to be a mix, percussive, punchy recoil from a slowdown that allows you as a listener to wind up and fully appreciate what's happening, and then to have a kind of a cathartic response that at the same time is not exhausting. So take all three of those components, your technique, the rate at which you speak, and the time spent between phrases, to really guide how you sculpt that. Anyway, I think that covers the main points I wanted to cover. Um, there's You can really kind of delve deeper if you want to talk about pausing at punctuation and how individual pauses affect the listener, because, as I said, pacing is performance. It does have an effect on how things feel, but so much of that is down to the specific feelings that need to be evoked that we can't dig too deep into that here without a bunch of examples, and I didn't prepare them. But hopefully that gives you some things to think about as far as managing, adjusting, and tuning your pace over time, and being really intentional about it. And to be able to think about it in all of its various aspects so that when you're tinkering with your pace, you're not just slowing everything down and hoping that that solves whatever it is you want to solve. You may be selling yourself short by adjusting one of those three things that you didn't really need to adjust. Maybe it was just fine. So I hope that's been helpful. Take care.